Good morning. Welcome back. Today is December 11th. And before we get to talking about Paul and his adventures in Corinth, let's talk about what happened on this date. Well, first of all, it was on this date in 1620 that the Mayflower Pilgrims came ashore in Massachusetts. And then, of course, all of the stuff that happened with the Pilgrims. Now, keep in mind, the Pilgrims were not the first to land in the New World. There were other colonies already here. There were Spanish colonies. There were French colonies. There was I think the Massachusetts Bay Colony was already planted. So there were other colonies. The Pilgrims were not the first, but they were the ones that ultimately led into what we call Thanksgiving. So it was on this date in 1620 that they came ashore. On this date in 1640, the Root and Branches petition was presented to Parliament. Now, the Root and Branches petition was a petition signed by 1,500 individuals, which supposedly represented 15,000 stakeholders that desired Parliament to eliminate the structure of the Anglican Church. Okay, that is the root and branches of this organization. Okay, that is the bishops and the archbishops, which was essentially a holdover from the Catholic Church organization. Okay. Parliament was not able to deal with it right at that point. They did deal with it later, 1646, and it lasted this. So they eliminated the archbishops and the bishops for about 15 years. But once Charles II comes back onto the throne in 1660, I want to say, that organization was put right back into operation. But it's on this date that the petition was first published. It was on this date in 1816 that Indiana became the 19th state in the Union. Now, there's an interesting story to this, okay? And basically, here's what it is. When this area, that is the Northwest Territory, was first mapped out in the late 18th century as a result of the Northwest Ordinance of 1787, it was anticipated that the northern border of Indiana and the northern border of Illinois would both be at the bottom of Lake Michigan, kind of like this little picture right here. Okay. Well, when Indiana in 1816 went to apply for statehood, they realized that, hey, wait a minute, we want a little bit of access to Lake Michigan. And so they moved their border up about 20 miles. Okay. And then they applied for statehood with that little piece of Lake Michigan real estate there as part of the state of Indiana. And then it looked like this map here. Well, 2 years later, when Illinois was preparing to apply for statehood, they thought, well, wait a minute, if Indiana can do that, we don't want to be left without any Lake Michigan real estate. So Illinois moved its border 70 miles north. Okay. And so as a result of this, as a result of what Indiana did in 1816, Illinois does in 1818, and now pretty much the area of the state of Illinois that includes pretty much 2/3, if not 3/4 of the entire population of the state, was supposed to be part of Wisconsin originally, but now it's part of Illinois. And that would include Chicago and everything north, basically everything north of Route 80 was where that was supposed to go. But it all started because Indiana became a state on this date in 1816. In 1913, Da Vinci's famous painting, the Mona Lisa, was recovered 2 years after it was stolen out of the French museum, the Louvre. Now, normally that's an interesting story, but for those of you who have seen the new Knives Out movie, you know why that is a little bit more interesting because of that. So there you go, on this date, 1913. In 1936, King Edward VIII abdicated the throne of England to Mary Wallace Simpson, who was a twice divorced American woman. Now, actually, that's not technically correct. She was once divorced, and she was in the process of divorcing her second husband. Okay, so she was actually still married to her second husband while she and the king became an item. Okay, but it was just deemed too unacceptable for a woman married to the sitting king of England to have two living ex-husbands. So he abdicates the throne and marries Wallace Simpson, and they lived happily ever after for the next 30 years or so. Of course, when he abdicates the throne, his brother becomes king, and his brother becomes George VI. George VI is the king from 1936 to 1952. in 1952. He dies. His daughter Elizabeth becomes the queen. Elizabeth II. Elizabeth II is the queen from 1952 to 2022, only recently died, and now we have King Charles III. That all started because Edward VIII abdicated on this date in 1936. In 1958, Archibald MacLeish's play J.B. debuted on Broadway. Now, this play was very popular, won a Tony Award in 1959 for the best play on Broadway. Now, most of us probably are going, so what? I don't know a thing about this play. Well, what's interesting is that this play is actually a modern-day retelling of the book of Job. Now, I will confess I have not actually seen the play, but if I ever see an opportunity to see JB, it's going to be the tops on my list. Okay? Birthdays today. Today is Giovanni di Lorenzo de' Medici's birthday. He's born in this date in 1475. And if that name doesn't roll trippingly off your tongue, perhaps you know him better by his more popular name, Leo X, Pope Leo X, who was the Pope of the Catholic Church from 1513 to 1521. Now, that should ring a bell with you because 1513 to 1521 was right during the period when the Reformation took place. So basically, you ask yourself, was Pope Leo a good pope? Well, I don't know. When he started his papacy, the Catholic Church was all together. When he ended it, you had the Protestants, you had the Lutherans, and all of these guys. So who knows? But Leo X, born on this date, 1475. And finally, today is Rita Moreno's birthday. She is 91 years old today. Rita Moreno, many of you remember her from her Academy Award-winning role in the West Side Story, the 1961 version of the West Side Story. Although some of you may remember her as having a role in the very recent, I believe it was 2021 version of West Side Story as well. She played a different character, not the same character. But happy birthday to Rita Moreno and to Pope Leo X. So, all right. Well, today we're going to talk about Acts chapter 18. We're going to go into Corinth with Paul, and we're also going to meet Aquila, Priscilla, and Apollo. So let's get back to talking about that today. Good morning. Welcome back. We're here to continue our discussion of Acts. Today we're in Acts chapter 18. The bigger picture, again, we're talking about the writings of Luke. Okay, and Luke is many people believe to be a Gentile doctor who accompanied on occasion the Apostle Paul. And we talked about this when we were talking about Acts chapter 16, that sometimes he's with him, sometimes he's not. And you can tell based on whether the description or the story says we did this, or Paul did this, Paul did that. Okay. But the big picture of Luke, remember, the Gospel of Luke talks about how Jesus ministered to outsiders and how the gospel was for outsiders. And of course, in the Jewish context, the Gentiles were the ultimate outsiders. Like everything about a Gentile screamed outsiders. And of course, now as we get into Acts, we see how the gospel moves from Jerusalem to Samaria to the uttermost parts of the earth, specifically how it gets to Rome. All right. And so what we have is we have a series of events that take place that show several things, but big picture, it shows how the Lord moved the gospel to Rome. Or that might not be the right way to put it, just how the gospel got to Rome, how Paul got to Rome. I imagine at one point this guy Theophilus, if he is in fact a person, sat down and said to Luke, maybe Luke is his nephew or something like that. Say, hey, you know this Paul guy. How did this all come about? And Luke says, well, let me tell you. And he writes first the Gospel of Luke and then the book of Acts. Okay, so we've been going through Acts, and we're past the halfway point now. In fact, we are, this is almost entirely going to be the rest of this discussion. Really, actually, once the Council of Jerusalem is over, it's all about Paul, okay? We're going to see a reappearance in, I think, 22, where Philip, one of the seven, is going to make a reappearance. But other than that, the rest of the disciples, the rest of the apostles are out of the picture. They are completely out of the picture at this point, okay? It's just about Paul and his missionary journeys, okay? And when we left him, he was on his second missionary journey, a missionary journey that once again started in Antioch and went back through. Actually, it started in a conflict. It started with this disagreement with Barnabas, and so Paul and Silas take off in Acts chapter 16. We have the story of the Philippian jailer, and then in Acts chapter 17, we have Paul at the Areopagus. We talked about that last week, okay? And so now, today in chapter 18, we're going to talk about Paul moving to Corinth. Now, Corinth is another city in Europe, and it's a little bit west of Athens. But it's still in Macedonia, but it is still considered to be European. Okay, so now we're going to talk about Paul in Corinth. So again, remember when Paul was at the Areopagus, or Mars Hill for the KJV fans of us, he talked about the altar to the unknown God, and he was fine with going through, and he was giving the Gentile sermon that he had, and that is starting from creation and starting from how God has provided. And he was going great guns. He had him in the palm of his hand until he got to the point of the resurrection. Okay, and I think one of the reasons why Paul later on talks about the resurrection, I think it's in 1 Corinthians 15, being a stumbling block. Don't quote me on that because I'm not sure. Talks about the resurrection being a stumbling block. It is just every time he gets to the resurrection, that's when things start to fall apart. Okay. And again, at the end of 17, verse 32, when they, that is the people at the Areopagus, heard about the resurrection of the dead, some of them sneered, but others said, we want to hear you again. Okay. But regardless, so in verse 18, chapter 18, beginning with verse 1, we see Paul leaving Athens and moving on to Corinth. Okay, so after this, that is, after the events in the Areopagus, okay, Paul left Athens and went to Corinth. There he met a Jew named Aquila, a native of Pontus, who had recently come from Italy with his wife Priscilla, because Claudius had ordered all Jews to leave Rome. Paul went to see them, and because he was a tent maker as they were, he stayed and worked with them. Every Sabbath he reasoned in the synagogue, trying to persuade Jews and Greeks. Okay, so couple of things in this particular passage. Okay, first of all, we see Paul leaving Athens, moving to Rome. Okay, so traveling west, not to Rome, to Corinth. So he goes to Corinth. So Paul is in Corinth. Okay, he's in the town of Corinth. Okay, and there he meets this couple, Aquila and Priscilla, who are from Rome. Now, Rome itself is even further to the west from where they are. Okay, of course, Rome is Rome. It hasn't moved. It's at the bottom of Italy. I've been there. Okay, but it's further to the west now. And really, what's interesting is here Aquila and Priscilla come to Corinth, and Paul comes to Corinth, and they meet there. Okay, so Paul went to see them, and here suddenly they've got this conversation about Rome, because again, Aquila and Priscilla are there because Claudius, and this is something that I believe, I think they said this happened around 49 AD. Okay, so we're about, give or take, a year or so, we're about 14 or 15 years after the resurrection. But they've come from Rome, and they're meeting with Paul. Okay. And no doubt the conversation is like, well, what's going on in Rome, or what happened, kind of thing. And what we know from this is that it's a hostile environment at that point for Jews. Okay, so Aquila and Priscilla are forced out of Rome because they're Jewish, not necessarily because they're believers, not because they're followers of the way, but because they're Jewish. Okay, so regardless, so Aquila and Priscilla are here in Rome, in Athens. I'm going to get it right. Yeah, they're in Corinth, and they meet with Paul. Now, it turns out that Aquila and Priscilla have an occupation. They're tent makers. Okay, now keep in mind, this was a much more important
occupation in first century Europe and first century Palestine and that area than it is today. Okay, because for a lot of people traveling, tents were a main function, a place to live. Okay, and so it was again, it's not quite the same as saying someone is a carpenter. I'm a house builder. Okay, I'm a home builder, sort of thing. Okay, so but it's an occupation. Okay, so it's an occupation, and one of the things that Paul takes great pride in, later on when he talks to Ephesus, we're going to see it, and in some of his epistles we see it, but we see that Paul takes great pride in the fact that he was never a liability, and in that he earned his keep. Okay, and I think that is a really fascinating point, and I think it's something that we can look at and say, how does this apply to the church today? Okay, so did the rest of the apostles, did they maintain their occupations? Did Peter and James, well, certainly not James, he's dead at this point, but John and all, did they continue their tent making or whatever? And I say that because nowadays we talk about tent making, we talk about somebody who is bivocational, somebody who's calling, is to minister in some way, but they take a job to pay the bills, kind of thing, And it's really an interesting discussion if you really start thinking about it, because there's all kinds of ramifications. It's like, if you remove the financial incentive from ministry, how does that change things? Okay, so you think about all of the ministries you've been in or you've been involved with, and you think if there was no financial risk, okay, if there was no financial risk at all, how would this ministry be different? Would it be better? Would it be worse? I don't know. But regardless, so Paul hears about Aquila and Priscilla, and he says, well, they're tent makers, and they're apparently believers, so I'm going to meet up with them in the town of Corinth. Okay, and again, it was not uncommon, and we talked about this with Pharisees, that Pharisees weren't, you didn't usually, or I shouldn't say you didn't usually, I mean, there were professional Pharisees, but generally speaking, being a Pharisee was kind of like being a Democrat or a Republican. Okay, kind of. It's not an apples to apples comparison, but it's kind of close. That the fact that you were a Democrat or a Republican in 2022 the U.S. doesn't necessarily mean that you're getting paid by them, that you're making your living as a Democrat or a Republican. So in a similar way, being a Pharisee was not necessarily a paying gig. It could be, but it wasn't necessarily a paying gig. Okay, so they had other occupations, and Paul's occupation was being a tent maker. Okay, so Paul went to see them, and because he was a tent maker as they were, he stayed and worked with them. So every Sabbath he reasoned in the synagogue, trying to persuade Jews and Greeks. So while he's there in Corinth, he during the week, Monday through Friday, or Sunday through Monday, I guess, Sunday through Friday, he's working with Aquila and Priscilla as tent makers. Okay, on Saturday, which is the Sabbath day, he goes into the synagogue and he preaches and tries to convince the Jews and those God-fearers there, which is kind of very typical of what his MO, modus operandi, had been. Okay, he goes in and preaches to them there in Corinth. Okay, in verse 5, when Silas and Timothy came from Macedonia, Paul devoted himself exclusively to preaching, testifying to the Jews that Jesus was the Messiah. Now, so apparently what happens, if you remember, Paul had left Timothy and Silas back in Berea or in Thessalonica, one of those two, and then Paul was in Athens by himself, and he was walking around, and now he's in Corinth by himself. But now Timothy and Silas have shown up. And again, Silas is the partner he chose in lieu of Barnabas at the end of Acts chapter 15. And he brings Timothy along with. Timothy is a Gentile, but he has him circumcised. Okay, so moving into this this phase now, when Timothy and Silas show up, apparently, okay, again, we're just trying to speculate based on the evidence there. Okay, apparently they bring with them enough money to support Paul's full-time ministry. They bring an offering or something, because it says when they arrived, when Timothy and Silas arrived, then Paul is able to devote himself full time. He doesn't have to be a tent maker anymore. Okay? When Silas, in verse 5, when Silas and Timothy came from Macedonia, Paul devoted himself exclusively to preaching, testifying to the Jews that Jesus was the Messiah. But like in other communities, this doesn't necessarily go over well with everyone. Verse 6, but when they opposed Paul and became abusive, he shook out his clothes in protest and said to them, your blood be on your own heads. I am innocent of it. From now on, I will go to the Gentiles. Now, this is the second time we've heard Paul say this, okay? And it is not the last, okay? So basically, Paul goes into a town and he focuses on the Jews until the Jews kick him out. And the Jews say, no more, okay? And at that point, Paul says, fine, I'm going to go to the Gentiles. I don't know, it's funny to me, okay? So it says, then Paul left the synagogue and went next door to the house of Titius Justus, a worshiper of God. Crispus, the synagogue leader, and his entire household believed in the Lord, and many of the Corinthians who heard Paul believed and were baptized. Okay, so apparently the synagogue leader, or he goes to a house next door, and there he meets with the synagogue leader, and the synagogue leader here is Titius Justus. I'm sorry, Crispus. So he meets Crispus, and Crispus is he's a Jew who believes, but he comes to this Gentile's house. It's kind of interesting that this Jewish leader comes to the Gentile's house in order to hear the gospel, and he believes, and he and his household are converted. Okay. Says, and many of the Corinthians who heard Paul believed and were afraid. Now, verse 9, and we've talked about this in the past, but it's interesting how sometimes, not always, and this is the key, not always, but it certainly in the book of Acts, sometimes the Spirit is very, very explicit in terms of what he wants Paul or the church to do. And this is one of those situations where he comes to Paul and he says, one night the Lord spoke to Paul in a vision, verse 9. Do not be afraid. Keep on speaking. Do not be silent. For I am with you, and no one is going to attack and harm you, because I have many people in this city. So Paul stayed in Corinth for a year and a half, teaching them the word of God. Okay. And I think this is significant because in the past, once Paul gets kicked out of the synagogue, he's like, okay, that's it. I'm moving on to the next town. And the Spirit comes to Paul and says, no, you've been kicked out of the synagogue, but I want you to stay in Corinth. I want you to stay here, and I want you to preach. I want you to teach. And that's exactly what Paul does. Okay? And he says in verse 11, so Paul stayed in Corinth for a year and a half, teaching them the word of God. Okay? Now, the thing that I find interesting about this visitation, to me, I kind of see a parallel to 1 Kings 19. Okay? Now, you think about it, Paul says to the Jews, that's it, I'm out of here. I'm going to go to the Gentiles. And in the past, what he's done at that point is he's had a couple of meetings, and then he moves on to the next city. Okay? And perhaps, and again, this is speculation on my part, perhaps at this point, Paul is thinking, well, listen, I'm all by myself here. Now, is he? No, because Timothy and Silas are there, and Aquila and Priscilla are there. We know that. But regardless, Paul is kind of feeling like these guys aren't buying my message. I'm going to get out of there. And that reminds me, 1 Kings 19, and this is Elijah after Mount Carmel. If you remember Elijah after Mount Carmel, 450 prophets of Baal killed, and then there's the rain and all of that, and then Ahab takes the message and goes back to Jezebel with it. Jezebel sends him a message. Jezebel sends Elijah a message, says, I'm going to kill you. And Elijah gets worried about it and runs, and the Lord catches up with him, and says, what are you doing, Elijah? And Elijah's like complaining, going, hey, nobody loves me, everybody hates me, kind of thing. And amongst other things, and again, this is an interesting story, but we don't have time to go into this. Among other things, the Lord tells Elijah, hey, listen, just so you know, I have 7,000 people in Jerusalem, or in Israel. I have 7,000 other people. I know you think you're all alone, Elijah. I have 7,000 other people here. And here the Lord is telling Paul, it's like, listen, you may think you're alone, but I got plenty of other people in this town. Okay, I have plenty of other people in this town. Which, again, like with Elijah after Mount Carmel there, here Paul in Corinth, we kind of think that, because nobody is doing ministry exactly like me, I'm the only one doing it at all. And I think the Lord is kind of thinking, you guys, you think you're the only ones that are doing a work there? I mean, I got all these other people doing work there. Okay, and there's a whole interesting discussion that we could have there, but we're not going to do it today. But regardless, so the Lord says to Paul, listen, I got a lot of people here, and I want you to minister to them. I want you to teach them the Word of God, and so stay. And Paul does. And he stays there for about 18 months, a year and a half. Okay, so Paul stayed in Corinth, verse 11, for a year and a half, teaching them the Word of God. So he's in Corinth. Now, while Gallio, verse 12, was proconsul of Achaia. Now, Achaia is the kind of the geographical area where Corinth is. It's sort of like if Chicago is a city, then Illinois is a state. Corinth is a city, Achaia is a state. Kind of, that's sort of, again, that's not an apples to apples comparison, but it's close enough, okay? So, while Gallio was proconsul of Achaia, the Jews of Corinth made a united attack on Paul and brought him to the place of judgment. Okay, now, Gallio is a proconsul. He is a Roman leader, almost certainly. I mean, like 99.9999% certain that this guy is not Jewish. Okay, he is a Roman leader here. Okay. And the Jews think, well, let's bring Paul up in front of this Jewish, or in front of this Roman leader. Okay. Now, again, it's what worked to at the end of Luke 22:23. This is what the chief priests and councils did. They brought Jesus in front of Pontius Pilate. Here they're like, well, let's bring Paul in front of this Gentile ruler. He will settle it for us. Okay. This man, verse 13, they charge is persuading the people to worship God in ways contrary to the law. Okay. And, first of all, this isn't really true. Okay. This is their straw man argument. But I think they're trying to make Gallius think that, he's violating some Roman law, but Gallius isn't going to fall for that. Okay. And Paul is right there, ready to go. Okay, so basically they've created this moment. They brought Paul in front of the people, in front of this Gallius, this Gentile ruler, and Paul is ready to go. Okay, and Gallius goes, whoa, wait, just stop right there. Okay. Just as Paul was about to speak, and I just kind of get that idea. Paul's like ready. Paul's got his notes. He's got his books. I'm ready to go, man. He's got his iPad out. He's got it ready. He's got, he's got his ties ready. Gallio said, whoa, wait a minute. Just hold off, okay? Gallio said to them, if you Jews were making a complaint about some misdemeanor or serious crime, it would be reasonable for me to listen to you, okay? But since it involves questions about words and names in your own law, settle the matter yourself. I'll not be a judge of such things. So he drove them off. Now, this is fascinating to me. Okay, first of all, just because I think it's just interesting, he just shuts off Paul and goes, I don't need to hear this. This is not my jurisdiction. You don't have standing here. Whatever legal point Gallius is making is like, I'm not dealing with this kind of stuff. Now, it's interesting that the people in Corinth think that this is a good idea, that we've got this doctrinal dispute about the nature of the Jewish religion, that let's bring it to Gallius, let's bring it to the Roman leader. Okay, so this is in Corinth. Okay, and why that's important is because later on, and again, one of the things that's just fascinating to me, and I've never really picked up on it before. I'll be honest, I'll just say, just for whatever reason, it just never connected until I really started doing this particular study. Just how the events of the book of Acts tie into the epistles. Because in 1 Corinthians chapter 6, there's an interesting passage where Paul excoriates the church at Corinth, which is where he is right now, for what? For taking their disputes to court. He says, why do you do this? He says, this is bad for the believers, bad for the way, bad for Jews. And it's interesting that here you've got this experience where maybe they're the only ones who thought, we can settle this doctrinal dispute in court. I mean, think about it today in 2022. Okay, and I can't really think about, very big picture. Let's just say somebody really wants to settle the Arminian Calvinist dispute. Okay, can a person, are we all predestined one way or the other, or do we have some agency in it? Let's settle this, and the way we're going to settle this is we're going to file a lawsuit in the local court system, and we're going to take it in front of a non-believing judge and say, here, what do you believe? Now, we would think about that's absurd. Why would we do that? But that's exactly what the people in Corinth are doing here. And Paul later on in his epistle that we call 1 Corinthians, more on that in a minute, says, why are you guys doing this? Why do you guys do this? It just looks bad, okay? So what's interesting then is this doesn't go over well. Not everybody thinks this is a great idea. Verse 17, then the crowd there turned on Sosthenes, the synagogue leader, and beat him in front of the proconsul. And Gallio showed no concern whatsoever. Okay, so there's a couple of interesting things here about that. First of all, I think one of the reasons why Luke includes this particular detail is just to show, don't think of Gallio as being some wise, great guy. He's not. He's not. He apparently had no trouble thinking, okay, you guys settle this yourselves, and if you want to beat each other up, go ahead. I don't really care, and I'll just sit here and watch. Which is essentially what he does. He just sits there and watches them beat each other up. Okay. Now, another question that comes to mind right away is like, wait a minute, what happened? What about Crispus? Remember in verse 8, Crispus was a synagogue leader, and he became a believer. Now, who's Sosthenes? Why are they suddenly jumping this guy? Well, there's a couple of ideas. We don't really know. Okay, we don't really know. We just know that in verse 17, Sosthenes is talked about as being the synagogue leader, whereas in verse 8, Crispus was talked about being the synagogue leader. Well, first of all, it could be, and again, these are just possible explanations. One of them could be that because of his conversion, Crispus was removed, and Sosthenes has replaced him. That's one option. Okay. Again, this is speculation. We don't really know. Okay. Another option is that Crispus had more than one name. Crispus called Sosthenes, and they are in fact beating on the same guy. No. Again, it's just speculation. Another idea is that perhaps there were two leaders at this particular synagogue. Crispus is one, Sosthenes is the other. Crispus is nowhere to be found, so they beat up on Sosthenes. Another option, and there's a fourth option, is that there's more than one synagogue. And Crispus is the leader of the synagogue that Paul was at, and Sosthenes is the leader at a different synagogue. Okay, for whatever reason we don't know, but they pull in this guy Sosthenes and say, well, we're going to beat on him for his part in this. Okay, and Gallio doesn't do a thing about it. Okay, and again, it's sad for Sosthenes. All indications are he had nothing to do with it, and yet I think the point here is just so we don't get too enamored with Gallio. Okay, Gallio is not that nice a guy. All right, verse 18. Paul stayed on in Corinth for some time. Okay, this is still after the whole Gallio thing. Then he left the brothers and sisters and sailed for Syria, accompanied by Priscilla and Aquila. Before he sailed, he had his hair cut off at Cenchreae because of a vow he had taken. All right. Now, I mentioned this earlier, and I think the easiest way to explain this, and again, is we're not 100% certain. What is this vow he's talking about? Is it a Nazirite vow, or is it some other sort of vow? And I think the best explanation is to just say that Paul always considered himself a Jew. Okay? He always considered himself a Jew and always followed the Jewish law. Now, at a certain level, there's nothing wrong with that. Okay? If you want to do all of this stuff, that's great. Where it becomes problematic is if you say, well, this is effective for my relationship with God. Okay? Or you say this is an alternative to the way. Okay, it's like if you want to continue on with the Jewish tradition because that's your family background, that's the thing you do. Well, then go ahead. There's nothing wrong with that. It's just a question of okay, but don't make it any more than it actually is. And Paul, and we've mentioned this earlier. Paul would, I think, would do a lot of this kind of stuff just so those within the Jewish community would see that he is, in fact, still an observant Jew. Okay, so he's not some radical who's rejected. He's not like, nowadays we talk about ex-evangelicals, people who have deconstructed from evangelicalism. They're not like ex-van Jewish people. Paul is saying, listen, I am coming to you from inside the community. And he continued to do this kind of stuff. That's, to me, the best explanation I have, that he did this just so he could continue to be a witness inside the Jewish community. So Paul is getting ready to leave Corinth and go to Ephesus, and prior to doing this, he takes some vow and has his faith saved accordingly. Okay. Verse 19. They arrived at Ephesus. They arrived at Ephesus. Okay, they arrived. So Luke is not with them. They arrived at Ephesus, where Paul left Priscilla and Aquila. He himself went into the synagogue and reasoned with the Jews. Now, of course, I don't believe Priscilla wouldn't have been allowed in the synagogue. And it could be that Aquila was Gentile. Again, he came from Rome, but he's Jewish. Maybe he was a Jewish proselyte. I don't know. But for whatever reason, Aquila and Priscilla aren't following Paul into the synagogue. When they asked him to spend more time with them, okay, he declined. All right, and I think he's talking here about Priscilla and Aquila. Stay with us here in Ephesus for a while. But as he left, he promised, I will come back if it is God's will. Then he set sail from Ephesus. When he landed at Caesarea, he went up to Jerusalem and greeted the church and then went down to Antioch. Okay. Now, what's happened here in this moment is Paul's second missionary journey has ended. Okay. That's it. That is the end. He's back in Antioch. So he's left Priscilla and Aquila in Ephesus, and he is back in Antioch. Okay, so end of Paul's second missionary journey, or Silas and Paul's first missionary journey, however you want to call it. Okay, now verse 23 is the start of Paul's third missionary journey. Okay, And it says, after spending some time in Antioch, Paul set out from there and traveled from place to place through the region of Galatia and Phrygia, strengthening all the disciples. So what Paul is doing here at the start of his third missionary journey is he's going back, retracing the steps of his first missionary journey, okay, that we talked about back in Acts chapter 13 and 14. Okay, so he's just kind of retracing these steps. And he's also, in this moment, I should point out, and I didn't point it out earlier, that some of his, like Galatians, and again, we don't exactly know, so we're kind of, there's sort of a guessing game here, but like Galatians and Thessalonians, the letters to the church at Galatia and the letters to the church at Thessalonica were quite possibly written during this time. Okay, we don't 100% know, but we're just kind of assuming, all right? But let's see. Verse 24, and this is the last thing we'll talk about. I'm going to introduce Apollos because this is an interesting story. Meanwhile, a Jew named Apollos, a native of Alexandria, came to Ephesus. Okay, so Alexandria, Egypt, northern Africa, had come to Ephesus. He was a learned man with a thorough knowledge of the Scriptures. He had been instructed in the way of the Lord, and he spoke with great fervor and taught about Jesus accurately, though he knew only the baptism of John. Okay, now, specifically what this means, we're not 100% certain, but basically it's like and again, the bottom line here is he had not had the indwelling of the Holy Spirit at this point, even though he understands John's message that Christianity, or that Judaism was not supposed to go this way, it was supposed to go this way. And going this way leads to Jesus being the Messiah. And he knew that, he understood that, and he was able to preach it. He was a very smart man, very educated man, very talented leader of the church, okay? So he goes into Ephesus, and he shows up there, and he starts preaching as a disciple, essentially as a disciple of John the Baptist. Okay, he had been instructed in the way of the Lord, and he spoke with great fervor and taught about Jesus accurately, though he knew only the baptism of John. He began to speak boldly in the synagogue. When Priscilla and Aquila heard him, they invited him to their home and explained to him the way of God more adequately. Now, this is really, really interesting, because what's happened here is you've seen the gospel moving out, like, generations isn't the right word, but certainly, you have the original apostles, and then you have the apostle Paul, and then you have Aquila and Priscilla, and now they're ministering to. So Paul ministers to, so the original apostles minister to Paul. Paul ministers to Aquila and Priscilla. Aquila and Priscilla meet Apollos and minister to him. Okay, and now they're in Ephesus. Okay. When Priscilla and Aquila heard him, they invited him to their home and explained to him the way of God more adequately. And again, although it's not said, it's at that point, it's often believed that, okay, well, at that point, he receives the Holy Spirit. He gets the idea, oh, Jesus, death, burial, and resurrection, the whole thing. Verse 27, when Apollos wanted to go to Achaia, remember, what's in Achaia? Achaia is the kind of the general area, Corinth. Okay, so Corinth. The brothers and sisters encouraged him and wrote to the disciples there to welcome him. When he arrived, he was a great help to those who by grace had believed, for he vigorously refuted his Jewish opponents in public debate, proving from the Scriptures that Jesus was the Messiah. Okay, so Paul has left Corinth. Apollos, a recent convert of sorts, not quite the same thing, but had gone to Corinth. Okay, so Paul is not there. And the interesting fact to me is there's no actual record in the text, any of the text, that Paul and Apollos ever actually met. Okay, so what I mean by that, and I believe they did. I find it hard to believe that they didn't. But there's nothing in the text that says they did. So we have the church at Corinth, where Paul goes in, creates a church at Corinth, stays there for 1.5 years, preaches to the Gentiles, preaches to the Jews, develops a church, grows the church, then he leaves. Then sometime later, Apollos shows up. And Apollos becomes the leader of the church. If not the pastor of the church, he certainly becomes the leading light of that church itself. And this is really fascinating because later on, Paul is going to circle back and be writing letters to the church at Corinth. And just for interesting thing, I just want to kind of look real quick. So 1 Corinthians, not Paul's first letter to the church at Corinth, okay? Don't have time to get into it right now, but there's an indication in the text that Paul had written a previous letter to the church at Corinth. In fact, there's also indication that he wrote a letter between number 1 and number 2. So it's often believed that there are at least 4 letters written to Corinth, the church at Corinth, only 2 of which that we have copies, which would be the 2nd and the 4th. But just looking in the first letter, Paul is writing to the church at Corinth, and Apollos is mentioned 4 times. And the first time he's mentioned is in verse 12, and he's talking about the state that church is in. And he says, what I mean is this: one of you says, I follow Paul, another, I follow Apollos, another says, I follow Cephas, or which is believed to be Peter. Still another, I follow Christ. So you have these 4 different ideas of who you're going to follow. Okay, so again, Paul is writing to this church that he founded, but there's been another very significant leader come in since him. Okay, and it's this guy Apollos. Okay, in chapter 3, Paul of 1 Corinthians, Paul picks up this theme again. Chapter 3, beginning with verse 4. For when one says, I follow Paul, and another, I follow Apollos, are you not mere human beings? What after all is Apollos, and what is Paul? Only servants. And then you get the probably the most famous reference to Apollos by Paul. I planted the seed, Apollos watered, but God has been making it grow. But God giveth the increase in the King James. Okay, in 4:6 again, Paul just explains to the church. Now, brothers and sisters, I have applied these things to myself and Apollos for your benefit. See, I'm making this point to you so you understand the point I'm trying to make. And then later on in chapter 16 of 1 Corinthians, get to the page here, 16 beginning with verse 12, Paul says at the end of the book, now about our brother Apollos, I strongly urged him to go to you with the brothers. He was quite unwilling to go now, but he will go when he has the opportunity. So that kind of suggests that Apollos' end there had some issue, and he left. So that one of the reasons why Paul is writing is because Apollos has gone under some cloud. And I'm just speculating here. We don't know what it is. And Paul is looking to set everything straight and kind of bring Apollos back in. Now, like I said, there's no indication that there's one other reference to Apollos, and that's in the book of Titus. Let me find it here. Titus chapter 3, verse 13. Just Paul telling Titus, do everything you can to help Zenas, the lawyer, and Apollos on their way and see that they have everything they need. So again, Paul doesn't have any animosity towards Apollos, but again, just kind of, it's just sort of interesting. There's no indication in the text itself that Paul actually met Apollos, face to face. I mean, I think they probably corresponded, and they certainly had a lot of mutual friends, but no indication that they actually ever, got together. Just an interesting thought in my mind. Okay, so Paul is in. So now Paul is on his 3rd missionary journey, and Apollos is in Corinth, and in verse 19 we're going to talk about Paul going to Ephesus. Okay, or chapter 19 we're going to talk about Paul going to Ephesus, which is a community, a town where he spends an awful lot of time in. Okay, now I'm not going to spend a lot of time here because I want to talk about it next week. Okay, we're going to talk about Paul in Ephesus and what happens there. Great is Artemis, etc., and we'll see. We'll try and knock off 2 chapters next week as we wind our way down through the book of Acts. All right, well, that's all I got for today. Thank you all for being with me, And if you have any questions or anything, or by all means, send me an email, fax, mail. U.S. mail is great. You see me at church, whatever. If you have any questions, leave a note or comment in the Facebook page or in the thing, in the YouTube channel. Any one of those is great. So again, thank you very much, and we'll get back and talk to you next week about Paul in Ephesus.